My name is Olive Spencer. If someone had told me a year ago that I would betray my husband, I would have laughed in their face. Because I loved him. Because I thought I was a good person. Because I believed in loyalty. But life has a cruel way of revealing who we really are. It only takes one moment. One mistake. One decision you can never take back. For me, that moment happened in a stranger's garage while my husband lay unconscious in the next room. The smell of oil and dust thick in the air. My pulse pounding so hard I could barely hear my own thoughts. The heat of another man's hands on my skin. And the worst part? I let it happen. I told myself I had a choice. That I could have walked away. But I didn't. And for months, I thought that was my darkest secret. I thought the worst thing I had done was betraying the man who trusted me, who gave me everything. But then, I sat down with his boss. And what he told me, that was the real betrayal. The kind that makes your blood run cold. The kind that makes you question everything you thought was true. The kind that makes you wonder. Was I the betrayer? Or had I been betrayed all along? This story contains mature themes, emotional conflict, and the raw realities of infidelity. It is not meant to glorify or condone betrayal but to explore the deep psychological and emotional complexities that lead to these moments. Viewer discretion is advised. I used to believe I was a good wife. That I was different. That our love was strong enough to last forever. But I know better now. Fletcher and I had the kind of love story that seemed picture perfect from the outside. We met in high school, young, hopeful, naive. People saw us as the couple that had it all together. We were the ones everyone expected to make it, to grow old side by side, to prove that first love could last a lifetime. And I wanted to believe that. I really did. Fletcher was the kind of man people trusted. Steady. Reliable. He was never the loudest in the room, never the life of the party, but he had a quiet confidence about him. The kind of person who kept his promises, who believed in loyalty, in doing the right thing, in taking care of the people he loved. And for a long time I felt lucky to be one of those people. When he asked me to marry him, I said yes without hesitation. I was barely 20, still figuring out what it meant to be an adult, but love makes you reckless. Love makes you believe that saying yes is enough, that commitment alone will carry you through all the unknowns ahead. For a while, I was content. I played my role as the devoted wife, and Fletcher played his role as the dependable husband. We were building a life together, and on paper, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. But life is not a fairy tale. Love is not always enough. There is something people do not tell you about getting married young. They do not tell you that who you are at 20 is not who you will be at 25, at 30, at 40. They do not tell you that people change, that needs shift, that what makes you happy in one season of life may not be what fulfills you in the next. And deep inside, I was changing. I did not realize it at first. It was subtle. A quiet feeling, like a faint knock on a door you pretend not to hear. A restlessness. A question I could not quite form but could feel pressing against my ribs. I convinced myself it was normal. Every marriage has moments of doubt, right? But it was more than that. It was the way I found myself staring at the ceiling at night, unable to sleep, feeling an emptiness I could not explain. It was the way I would look at Fletcher and feel guilty for not feeling more. He was a good husband. A kind man. He had never hurt me, never given me a reason to question his love. So why was I questioning everything? I started wondering if I had made a mistake. If I had rushed into something before I had the chance to really know myself. I had spent my entire adult life as someone's girlfriend, someone's wife. I had never been just me. But admitting that felt wrong. Unfair. Selfish. So I buried it. I told myself that love was a choice, that happiness was something you built, not something you found. I convinced myself that this feeling would pass, that I just needed to focus on being a better wife, on being grateful for what I had. And for a while, I believed that. Until the night that changed everything. That night started like any other. Fletcher had been excited for weeks about the bachelor party. One of his old Navy friends was getting married, and they had planned a reunion of sorts. I remember the way he was that morning, lighter, more relaxed than usual. It was not often that he got to see his old Navy friends. He never talked about his time in the service much, but I knew it had shaped him. The discipline, the structure, the way he carried himself, he had come back from those years different. Stronger, maybe. More guarded, definitely. I told him to have fun, kissed him goodbye, and watched him walk out the door, never imagining that it would be the night that changed the course of our marriage. I spent the evening alone, curled up on the couch with a book, enjoying the quiet. I had not realized how much I craved solitude until I had the house to myself. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, expecting a message from Fletcher, maybe a check-in or a drunk text. But it was not from him. It was from Willa Townsend, one of the other Navy wives. Fletcher is wasted. He cannot drive. You need to come. For a long moment, I just stared at the message. A familiar frustration settled in my stomach. I was not surprised. Fletcher had never been a big drinker, but when he did drink, he was terrible at knowing his limits. He always said yes to one more, always convinced himself he could handle it. I sighed, setting my book down, already reaching for my keys. I should have been worried, but I was mostly annoyed. I was tired. I had been looking forward to a quiet night alone, and now I had to drive across town to pick up my drunk husband like he was some reckless teenager. As I pulled out of the driveway, I told myself I would give him an earful in the morning. At the time, I thought that was the worst of it. I had no idea that I was driving straight into a moment that would change everything. I had been to parties like this before. Loud voices, music thumping from a speaker that had blown out long ago, the air thick with alcohol, sweat, and the stale remnants of cigarettes. The kind of place where time stretched and responsibility faded, where men who had once worn uniforms and carried rifles now sat in circles telling half-true war stories, their pasts growing grander with every drink. But I had never been here like this, not as the wife coming to pick up her husband. And then I saw him. Ace Rowe. He was standing in the doorway like he belonged there, one shoulder pressed lazily against the frame, a half-empty glass dangling from his fingers. His eyes flickered toward me as I stepped inside, and for a moment, he just looked at me. Not with curiosity, not even with interest, but with something else. Amusement. Still a lightweight, huh, he said, shaking his head. Some things never change. There was something about the way he said it. The casual arrogance. The way his voice dragged, slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world to decide whether I was worth his attention. I had met Ace before, years ago, back when Fletcher and I were first dating. He had been part of the same Navy crew, but even then, he had been different from the rest. He had a presence about him, something sharp and unpredictable. A man who carried himself like he was never truly impressed by anything. Fletcher had never spoken highly of him. There had always been tension there, something unspoken. I had asked about it once, but Fletcher had just brushed it off. "Not worth talking about," he had said. Now, standing here, facing Ace's smug expression, I realized something. He didn't just dislike Fletcher. He resented him. I ignored him and pushed forward, searching for my husband. And then I saw him. Fletcher was slumped over on a couch, motionless. At first, I thought he was just asleep. That he had passed out like anyone else at a party that had gone on too long. But as I stepped closer, something in my chest tightened. He was too still. His breathing was too slow. His body limp in a way that did not seem natural. A strange wave of panic pressed against my ribs. I had seen him drunk before. But not like this. Not this, gone. I reached out and shook his shoulder lightly. "Fletcher, wake up." Nothing. I tried again, a little harder this time, pressing my fingers into his arm, shaking him. "Come on, Fletcher, we have to go." Still nothing. I heard Ace chuckle behind me. A low, unimpressed sound. "Looks like he is still as pathetic as ever," he said. "Some things really do not change." I turned sharply, heat rising in my face. I wanted to tell him to shut up, to wipe that smug look off his face, but I didn't. Because deep down, I felt something I did not want to admit. I felt embarrassed. Not just for Fletcher. For myself. I was the wife who had to come and pick up her husband like he was some reckless teenager. I was the one standing there, trying to shake life back into a man who was supposed to be my equal, my partner. And worst of all? I was standing in front of Ace Rowe, a man who had never respected my husband, proving him right. Something shifted in me at that moment. It wasn't just frustration. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was something darker. A thought whispered through my mind, uninvited but impossible to ignore. Why was I always the responsible one? Why was I always the one picking up the pieces? Why did I feel more like a caretaker than a wife? A marriage is supposed to be a partnership, an equal give and take. But standing there, looking at Fletcher passed out, I realized that it wasn't. I had been carrying more weight than I had ever admitted. And the worst part? I wasn't even sure if he noticed. For the first time, I felt something I had never allowed myself to feel before. Resentment. And resentment, once it takes root, grows like a weed. I should have walked out. I should have grabbed my husband, shaken him awake, and forced him into the car. I should have driven us home and let this night fade into nothing more than an unfortunate memory. But I didn't. Because Ace was not done with me yet. Before I could reach for Fletcher again, before I could even decide what I was going to do, I felt a hand wrap around my wrist. Firm. Unyielding. Ace. He was not rough, not forceful, not yet, but his grip sent a ripple of tension up my arm. A silent warning. Or maybe an invitation. "Look at this mess," he spat, yanking me toward the hallway. I stumbled slightly, my pulse hammering in my ears as I followed him, or rather, as he led me. When we reached the bathroom, he shut the door open with one hand and pointed. And that's when I saw it. Vomit. Everywhere. A sharp, acrid stench filled the air, making my stomach turn. The sink was covered, the floor stained. Fletcher's drunken mistake, left behind for someone else to clean. Ace turned back to me, his expression twisted with disgust. "You or your husband need to pay for this." His voice was sharp, accusing. Like this was my fault. Like I was responsible for the wreckage Fletcher had left behind. For a moment, something inside me flared, indignation, anger, shame. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. We do not have much money, I admitted. The words felt small. Weak. And I hated myself for saying them. I expected Ace to keep pushing. To mock me. To keep that sharp edge in his voice. But something changed. His expression shifted. The hard lines in his face softened, just slightly. His mouth curled at the corner, but this time it was not a smirk of disdain. It was something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or something darker. His gaze swept over me, slow and deliberate. Maybe we can work something out, he murmured. The words were simple. Innocent enough on the surface. But the way he said them, the way his voice dropped just slightly, sent a current through my body. A warning. A temptation. He reached for a bottle on the counter, a half-full glass of whiskey, and poured 2 drinks. He held one out to me. I should have refused. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I took it. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. People talk about betrayal like it happens in a single, catastrophic event. Like it is a lightning strike, sudden and unavoidable. But that is not true. Betrayal is slow. It is a series of tiny, almost imperceptible choices that seem harmless until they are not. It is 1,000 small moments of weakness that add up to a disaster. And this was mine. The moment I stopped resisting. The moment I let the door crack open. The moment I let myself listen to the part of me I had buried for so long. I lifted the glass to my lips and took a sip. It started with a touch. A simple, almost accidental graze of his fingers against my wrist. A moment that should not have mattered. But it did. Because for the first time in a long time I felt something. Something unfamiliar. Something dangerous. I was still standing in the bathroom doorway, the whiskey burning in my throat, when I felt him shift closer. My pulse quickened. He reached out, fingertips skimming my arm, feather-light. A question, a test. I should have pulled away. I should have stepped back. But I didn't. Because at that moment, my body was betraying me in ways my mind could not control. I had spent so long feeling numb. So long feeling nothing at all. And now, suddenly, I was awake. I could feel the warmth of his skin, the way his breath ghosted across my shoulder, the way his presence filled the space around me like an unspoken promise. He leaned in, his voice low, deliberate. "Your husband is a lucky man," he murmured. I exhaled sharply. A nervous laugh, a weak attempt to diffuse the moment. "I should go," I said, but the words were empty. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because he could see it. He could see that I wasn't moving. He could see that I was waiting. He reached for my hand, his grip warm and sure, and without thinking, I let him lead me. Away from the noise. Away from the others. Away from my husband. We stepped into the garage. The air was thick with silence. The only sound was my own heartbeat, pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Ace let go of my hand, but he didn't move away. Instead, he reached for the door and pulled it shut behind us. A simple action. A meaningless movement. And yet, it was everything. Because that was the moment I became someone else. That was the moment I crossed a line I could never uncross. That was the moment I betrayed the man who had loved me since I was 17. And the worst part? I wanted it. Hashtag the morning after, the first sign of change. Hashtag I woke up before the sun. The room was still dark, the heavy silence pressing against my skin like a weight. For a moment, I did not move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my body frozen in the stillness of the early morning. I felt nothing. Not panic. Not regret. Just a vast, empty quiet. I turned my head slightly, my gaze drifting to the other side of the bed. Fletcher was still asleep. His breathing was slow, steady, oblivious. He had no idea. And that was the strangest part. Nothing had changed. The world outside was exactly the same. The house, the bed, the man lying beside me, it was all unchanged. And yet, I had changed. Something inside me felt different. I waited for the guilt to come. I waited for the crushing weight of shame, for the overwhelming regret that should have made my stomach turn, my hands shake, my chest tighten. But it never came. Instead, I just felt distant. Like I was watching my life from the outside, observing it like a stranger. I studied Fletcher's face in the dim morning light. The familiar curve of his jaw, the softness of sleep still clinging to him. I had loved this man for years. He had been my best friend, my partner, the person I built my life with. But as I lay there, staring at him, a thought slid into my mind so effortlessly that it startled me. Why don't I feel anything? There should have been guilt, but there wasn't. There should have been shame, but all I felt was an odd sense of detachment. I expected to feel disgusted with myself, to wish I could take it back, to panic at the thought of what I had done. But instead, I felt something else entirely. I felt free. For the first time in years, I was not just Fletcher's wife. I was something separate. Someone different. And I liked it. I did not have the words for it yet, but in that moment, I realized something about myself that I had never been willing to admit before. I had spent so long belonging to someone else. So long shaping my identity around being Fletcher's wife, Fletcher's partner, Fletcher's everything. But last night? Last night, I had been mine. And that terrified me more than anything. Because if I did not feel guilty now, would I ever? Once you cross the line, it is easier to do it again. And again. It should have been a mistake. A single, regrettable lapse in judgment. Something I would bury deep inside myself and never repeat. But it was not. Because instead of guilt, I felt something else entirely. Excitement. There is something people do not talk about when they discuss infidelity. They talk about the betrayal, the heartbreak, the destruction. But they do not talk about the thrill. The adrenaline rush that comes with knowing you are doing something forbidden. The quickened pulse, the heightened senses, the way the world suddenly feels sharper, more alive. I had spent years trapped in routine. The predictability of marriage. The slow, steady rhythms of love that had lost their urgency, their fire. But now? Now, I felt awake. I had expected to be consumed by shame, to feel the crushing weight of what I had done. But instead, I found myself thinking about it constantly. Replaying the moment in my mind. The way Ace had looked at me. The way my body had responded before my mind could protest. It should have terrified me. But instead, I found myself craving it. Not just him, but the feeling. The feeling of stepping outside the boundaries I had lived in for so long. The feeling of being someone other than Fletcher's wife. For the first time in years, I was doing something just for myself. And that was intoxicating. There is a dangerous kind of freedom in deception. Once you realize that your life is no longer dictated by truth, that you can move in the shadows, that you can exist in a world that no one else can see, it changes you. Lying is supposed to be wrong. But when no one catches you, when no one even suspects, it starts to feel like power. And power is addictive. I began to notice things I had never paid attention to before. The way Fletcher never questioned me when I came home late. The way he trusted me so completely, so blindly. And instead of making me feel guilty, it only made me bolder. Because if he could not see what was right in front of him, then maybe, he had never truly seen me at all. Lying is an art. And I became a master of it. At first, it was small things. The way I smiled at Fletcher in the mornings, the same way I always had, as if nothing had changed. The way I kissed him goodnight with the same softness, the same affection, so he would never suspect. But the more I did it, the easier it became. I told myself I had control. That this was just a phase, just something I needed to get out of my system. But that was a lie too. Because the truth was, I had never felt more alive than I did when I was keeping secrets. It is terrifying how quickly deception becomes second nature. At first, it feels unnatural, a foreign weight pressing against your chest. But over time, it becomes effortless. Automatic. And after a while, you start to wonder. Was I always this good at lying? Or had I just never needed to before? I started to see just how easy it was to fool the people around me. How simple it was to tell Fletcher what he wanted to hear. How effortless it was to pretend that I was the same person I had always been. But I wasn't. I was changing. The problem with lies is that they multiply. One is never enough. You tell one lie to cover the truth. Then another to cover the first. And another. And soon, you have built an entire world of fiction, a reality where you are no longer bound by honesty, where you can be whoever you choose to be. And the scariest part? You start to prefer that version of yourself. I told myself Fletcher would never know. That as long as I played my role, as long as I smiled at the right moments, touched him at the right times, kept up the illusion of normalcy, he would never suspect. And I was right. Because Fletcher never saw it. Not the way I looked at my phone when I thought he wasn't watching. Not the way my mind wandered when he spoke. Not the way I had become a stranger in my own marriage. I convinced myself it did not matter. That as long as no one got hurt, as long as I maintained the balance, I could keep this part of myself hidden. But I was wrong. Because when you live a double life, you start to lose track of which version is real. And that is when everything falls apart. And then, one day, everything changed. It was an ordinary afternoon when I got the call. Lucas Hess. Fletcher's boss. His voice was calm, professional. He asked if I could come by his office. There was something he wanted to discuss, something about Fletcher. For a moment, a familiar panic twisted in my chest. Had Fletcher found out? Had he confessed something to his boss? But no. That was impossible. Fletcher had no reason to suspect me. I had been careful. I was always careful. So I convinced myself that this was about something else. Maybe Fletcher was up for a promotion. Maybe there was an issue at work. I told myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. But I was wrong. When I arrived, Lucas was already waiting. His office was cold, clinical. The kind of place where secrets were spoken in hushed tones and truth felt heavier than the walls could contain. He gestured for me to sit, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he just looked at me. Not with pity. Not with anger. But with something worse. Understanding. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, my mind racing. Then, finally, he spoke. I need to tell you something about your husband. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice even. Is everything okay? Lucas didn't answer right away. He exhaled slowly, like he was choosing his words carefully. How much do you really know about Fletcher? Something inside me went cold. I opened my mouth, ready to say everything, but the words caught in my throat. Because the truth was, I didn't know how to answer that question. For years, I had thought I knew him. But how much of that was real? Lucas leaned forward, lowering his voice. I think you should know, he's been keeping secrets from you. And in that moment, everything around me blurred. Because those were the words I had feared someone would say to me. I had spent so long hiding, so long covering my tracks, so long perfecting the art of deception, that I had never stopped to consider that I might not be the only one lying. And then Lucas said something that made my entire world tilt. Fletcher knew all along. My breath caught. My mind screamed impossible, but in my gut, something shifted. Because suddenly, memories began flooding back. The way Fletcher had been quieter lately. The way he would look at me just a second too long, like he was searching for something. The way he never asked where I was but seemed to know. I shook my head. No. That's not true. Lucas studied me for a moment before speaking again. Fletcher's been investigating you. I felt a sharp pressure in my chest, like the air had been punched from my lungs. Investigating? I repeated, barely able to force the word out. Lucas nodded. He hired someone. A private investigator. He's known about your affair for months. Everything inside me shattered. Because for so long, I had convinced myself that I was in control. That I was the one keeping secrets. That I was the one deciding what Fletcher did and didn't know. But the truth was, Fletcher had been watching me this entire time. My stomach twisted. My mind raced. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I had never experienced before. And then, Lucas delivered the final blow. But that's not the worst part, he said quietly. I stared at him, my throat dry. There's something else you need to know. I waited. Dreading the words before they even came. Fletcher has secrets of his own. I shook my head again, but this time, it was not because I did not believe him. It was because, deep down, I already knew. There had always been something about Fletcher. A quietness. A part of him that I could never quite reach. I had assumed it was just his nature. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe Fletcher had been keeping secrets long before I ever did. I felt my heart pounding. What kind of secrets? Lucas hesitated. And then, finally, he said it. The kind that change everything. You think you have control. You think you are making your own choices. But the truth is, the consequences always catch up. For months, I had lived in the illusion that I was the one pulling the strings. That I had mastered the art of deception. That I was the one keeping secrets. But now, sitting in that cold office, with Lucas Hess's words still ringing in my ears, I realized the truth. I had never been in control. Fletcher had known. He had been watching. He had his own secrets. And now, I was left with only one question. What happens next? For the first time, I saw what I had done. Not just to Fletcher. To myself. I had told myself this affair was about freedom. About reclaiming a part of myself that marriage had stolen. But as I sat in my car after leaving Lucas Hess's office, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, I realized something I had been too afraid to admit. I hadn't just betrayed Fletcher. I had destroyed myself. Because now, I didn't know who I was anymore. The version of me that Fletcher had fallen in love with? The loyal wife? The devoted partner? She was gone. The version of me that had thrived on secrecy, who had felt powerful in deception. She was unraveling, too. Because the moment I learned that Fletcher had his own secrets, the thrill disappeared. It was no longer just my game. I wasn't the only one lying. And suddenly, that realization made everything feel meaningless. I replayed every decision in my head. Every excuse. Every moment I had told myself I was in control. Every moment I had convinced myself I was different. But the truth was, I wasn't. I had become the very thing I never thought I would be. And now, I had to decide. What do I do next? Do I confess? Do I tell Fletcher everything? Would it even matter now? Because if he had truly known all along, then maybe, he had been waiting. Maybe he had been playing his own game. Maybe I was never the only one keeping secrets. And if that was true, if this entire marriage had been built on lies from both of us, then what were we? Were we just two strangers playing the roles of husband and wife? Or was there something even darker beneath the surface? A part of me wanted to confront him. To demand answers. But another part of me didn't want to know. Because if Fletcher had been keeping secrets from me, then that meant he was capable of the same deception I had justified in myself. And maybe, just maybe, his secrets were worse than mine. I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back at me. I used to think I was a victim of my own choices. But now, I am not so sure. Betrayal is not always what we think it is. Sometimes, the greatest betrayal is not in the lies we tell others, but in the ones we tell ourselves. Now, I have a question for you. What would you do? Would you confess? Would you walk away? Or would you keep pretending, knowing that your partner might be pretending too? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you think, if it made you question, reflect, or feel something you didn't expect, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts. Because sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that make us look at ourselves.